Welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to be talking about selecting elements. Hopefully we recognize the setup from earlier in the series. We have our code editor on the left and we have our active HTML document on the right. Check out the course description for information on where you can download these unstyled HTML documents and try out some of these CSS rules for yourself. Okay, so what is a selector in CSS? Well, we've already seen some basic examples of CSS selectors being used earlier in the course. A selector is something that indicates to the code which element we are trying to style. And if we were to create a rule that targeted any div, and we can see in our HTML document, we do have one div here. This div is a selector and it targets any div element. Now, there are different types of selector. We can target an element directly. We can target an element by its class, by its location in the document. We're going to have a look at some of the most important selectors in this lesson. But first of all, let's just make the location of this div really clear. And we're going to do that by adding a border. Now, don't worry too much about borders because we're going to discuss those in more detail a bit later in the course. But for now, we're going to set a border width of 1 pixel. We're going to set the border style to solid, and we're going to set the border color to blue. Let's refresh the page and take a look at that. So we can just see the location of our div because it's now surrounded in a blue box. And one thing we should always be thinking about, even in these test lessons, is we want to make things look reasonable. So something we can do here is add some padding. Let's add 25 pixels of padding. And let's also make use of a property known as border radius. This is a very nice property that you'll use probably quite often, I would imagine, and it's going to curve the edges of that border. So let's set that to 25 pixels as well, and then let's refresh the page. This was purely for layout. Now let's think about using the selectors on a really basic level. So note the structure of the document. First of all, we have a h1 tag. That's our title, selectors in CSS. We have a paragraph. We then have a div, and divs in HTML are really just used to divide the HTML into sections. So inside this div, we actually have 2 paragraphs. So we've got the first paragraph inside the div and the second paragraph inside the div. We then end the div and we have a final trailing paragraph, and this has the class of custom class. Notice as well that the h1 tag has an ID of title, and the first paragraph inside the div has the ID of first paragraph. Further down the document, we have some examples of various selectors that can be used and styled of. Now, in reality, we're going to be using some of these selectors much more frequently than others. And I would guess most of the time, we're going to be using one of these 3 basic selectors. So we will go through some of the others for informational purposes, just so we can be aware of what's possible in CSS. But in terms of what you need to remember, so you don't reference this every single day, is these 3 basic selectors here. So we have the ability to select a single element. We have the ability to select elements with a specific class, and we have the ability to select an element with a specific ID. So let's create a new CSS rule, and let's start with P. So this is an example of styling a specific element. Now what we'll do is we'll write some CSS, we'll say color red, and we're going to make use of a new property called background color, and we'll set that to yellow. So what this rule should do is it should turn every single paragraph red. So in this case, that's everything apart from the heading, which is H1. And it should set a background color of yellow on those paragraphs as well. Now we're going to keep our rule the same, but we're going to change our selector. And of course, anything that we've selected is going to have this yellow and red styling. Our final paragraph has this class, custom class. Now one of the main benefits of having classes is it allows us to associate styles with groups of elements. And we can select a class by using a dot and the name of the class. So dot custom class, this should only style the last paragraph in the document. So if we have many elements that want to be styled in a similar way, we can add a class to all of those elements and we can then set the custom CSS for that class. We next have the ID selector, so let's see if we can select that first paragraph ID. Now, just in case you don't know, what is the difference between a class and an ID? Well, they're fairly similar, apart from an ID is unique to a single element. We shouldn't be giving multiple elements the same ID, whereas we can give multiple elements the same class. So this selector should target the element with the ID of first paragraph. So in this case, we've given that ID not to the first paragraph in the document, but the first paragraph inside the div. And we can see that's currently highlighted. Now, this is honestly 90 to 95% of what you actually need to know about selectors in CSS. In fact, I wouldn't even say that the ID selector is that important. Most of the time, we'll be using an element selector or we'll be using a class selector. However, there are a wide range of additional selectors which may in some cases make our life easier or allow us to select parts of the page more accurately. So let's go through those additional selectors right now. Firstly, we can actually specify multiple selectors on a single rule by making use of a comma. So for example, if we typed h1, p, this is going to select any element that's either a paragraph or a h1 tag. So this is actually going to select our entire document in this case, because everything's either a p or h1 tag. If we remove the comma, we can then specify elements that are inside other elements. So this would be a paragraph inside a h1 tag, which doesn't really make any sense. So let's change that to a div. This is now going to target any paragraph that's inside a div. So anything inside that blue box should be highlighted. We can also select elements based on their location to other elements. For example, if we change this to div plus p, this is now going to style any paragraph that directly follows a div. So this is going to be the last paragraph in the HTML document in this case. And just so you know, these selectors are stackable. So for example, if we made a rule like this, we'll take a moment to think about this. What do you think this rule is actually specifying here? There's two components to this rule. So firstly, we know it's selecting a paragraph, but that paragraph is following something based on that plus directive. And it's following div p. Well, what does div p stand for? It stands for a paragraph inside of a div. So we've actually used this to select the second paragraph in the div, because it first of all looks for the paragraph inside a div, then it looks for the paragraph that directly follows that. So you can see we can get more granular control using some of these more advanced selectors. But in reality, would we do things this way? And we might do. Some developers would choose to do things this way. Other developers might choose to do something like this. Find their second paragraph and give it a class of second paragraph or an ID of second paragraph, and then just style that with a class selector. These are both two different ways of achieving the same thing. There's not a right or wrong answer here. Let's take a quick look at the wildcard selector in CSS. It can sometimes have applications. Now the wildcard character is the asterisk sign. So this actually selects every element in the document, including the body of the document itself. So you can see the whole document now is actually red with a yellow background. This is a good example of how not to style a website, by the way. Now the reason I've chosen to use the wildcard here is because it illustrates another CSS selector, which is to select based on attribute, which we can do using these square brackets here. So for example, if we type in ID, this is going to select any element that has an ID attribute. Well, which elements have an ID attribute? We have h1 and we have that first paragraph inside the div. Now keep in mind, this doesn't have to be a wildcard. It could just be an element like a p, for example. Now this obviously won't select the h1 because it's only targeting paragraphs that have an ID attribute. It's also possible to specify what the value of that attribute needs to be. So if we just return to our previous rule, and we can then be more specific with the value of that ID attribute. So let's see if we can just target the element that has the ID of first paragraph. So we can see that it's just targeted that single paragraph. Now this is useful for a variety of different attributes that we might have on a HTML element. It's probably not really that useful for an ID attribute. Why not? Well, we already have a built-in selector for ID. We can just type hashtag first paragraph. So we have a built-in way of accomplishing that particular selector. Now, there is one additional CSS rule you might use quite a bit, and it's actually referred to as a type of pseudo class. Now, what is a pseudo class in CSS? It's something that styles an element based on its state. And one of the most common ways that's used in a web page is when we hover our cursor over something, whether it's a button or a link, and we actually want to trigger a change in the way that element looks based on the fact that the user has hovered their cursor over that element. So let's change our rule to target paragraphs once more. We're going to use our colon to indicate we're using a pseudo class, and we're going to type hover. Now, if we refresh the page, we'll see that nothing is actually styled at the moment. That's because these changes will now only trigger when we hover our cursor over a paragraph element. Let's try it out. Now, since this particular pseudo class to style hover applies mostly to buttons and links, we may actually want to change our cursor here as well. And this is just a very useful CSS property and value to memorize, and that is cursor pointer. Let's see what that does. So now when we hover our cursor over the paragraphs, we get the change in styling, but we can see the cursor changes there to an icon that indicates to the user that this element is clickable. Of course, we haven't made these elements clickable yet. We would obviously code that functionality afterwards. Okay, so that's pretty much it for CSS selectors. Don't get overwhelmed. This was just to give you a flavor of all of the things you can do with CSS selectors. What you actually need to know is how to select an element using the element selector and how to select an element by its class. If you know those two things, you are 95% of the way there to mastering use of selectors, because the others are generally used with a very low frequency. And as we've seen, even when we use some of the other methods, there's usually a way to use one of these basic methods instead to achieve the same thing. Thanks very much for watching, guys. This was Selectors in CSS. I'll see you in the next part of the course.